Western Montana, October 1951. When Thomas Brennan started building what looked like a barn wrapped around his firewood shed, the loggers at McCarty's mill had a field day. They called it everything from a wooden fortress to a monument to paranoia. One man said Brennan was building a church for his cordwood. Another suggested he was preparing for the apocalypse. But when February temperatures dropped to 28 below zero and stayed there for 3 weeks, something remarkable happened. While every other homestead in the valley was splitting frozen, ice-logged firewood that smoked more than it burned, Thomas was pulling bone-dry splits from his protected storage, lighting fires that caught on the first match and burned clean through the night. Today, you'll understand why the structure everyone mocked became the most replicated design in 3 Montana counties, and how a simple protective shell solved a problem that had plagued frontier families for generations. The problem nobody wanted to talk about. Thomas Brennan had learned about firewood the hard way. He'd arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1949, built a respectable cabin on 20 acres of mixed pine and fir, and thought he'd done everything right. He'd cut 6 cords of wood that first summer, split it all to size, and stacked it under a sloped roof on the north side of his cabin. Tarps over the top, rocks holding them down. Standard practice. Everyone did it that way. His first winter taught him that standard practice was nowhere near good enough. The problem started in November with freezing rain. It came at night, coating everything in a shell of ice. By morning, his woodpile looked like it had been dipped in glass. When the temperature dropped and snow fell on top of that ice, moisture got trapped between the layers. The wood underneath, the stuff he'd split in August and thought was seasoned, started absorbing water through any crack or split the ice had forced open. By January, half his wood supply was compromised, not soaking wet, but damp enough that it hissed and steamed when he threw it on the fire. Damp enough to produce maybe 60% of the heat it should have. Damp enough that he was burning through a cord every 10 days instead of every 3 weeks. He'd done the math one cold February evening while his wife Helen sat mending near the stove. At this rate, they'd run out of wood by mid-March. With 6 weeks of winter still ahead, that meant cutting green wood in desperation, burning anything they could find, and suffering through temperatures barely above freezing inside their own home. Thomas had watched his father struggle with the same problem back in Wisconsin. He'd seen entire communities accept wet firewood as an unavoidable fact of winter life. You split more. You burned more. You accepted that half your effort went to fighting moisture instead of cold. But Thomas had also spent 3 years in the Army Corps of Engineers building supply depots in northern Alaska. He'd watched military logistics officers solve the exact same problem using a principle so simple it seemed obvious once you saw it. Complete weather protection with air circulation. The military didn't store fuel or supplies under tarps. They built structures. Simple pole barns with walls, roofs, and ventilation that kept precipitation out while allowing air to move through. The supplies stayed dry not because the buildings were heated, but because water never reached them in the first place. In May 1951, Thomas bought 200 board feet of rough-cut lumber from McCarty's mill and started building something that made his neighbors stop and stare. He began by erecting 4 corner posts, each one 12 feet tall and sunk 3 feet into the ground. The posts formed a rectangle 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, positioned 15 feet from the north wall of his cabin. Between these corner posts, he added intermediate posts every 6 feet, creating a sturdy framework. Then he began adding walls. Not solid walls, but board and batten construction with deliberate gaps. Vertical boards, spaced 3 inches apart, covered by narrower battens that overlapped the gaps by an inch on each side. Rain and snow couldn't penetrate straight through, but air could flow between the boards. The structure could breathe. The roof was steep-pitched and extended 2 feet beyond the walls on all sides. Overlapping cedar shakes shed water and snow aggressively, sending precipitation far from the stored wood below. He built a wide door on the south side, facing his cabin, making it easy to access wood during storms. The north side had a smaller door for loading wood in autumn. And here's the critical detail that most people missed. The floor wasn't solid ground. Thomas dug down 8 inches, laid a bed of coarse gravel, and built the structure on that drainage foundation. Any moisture that did somehow make it inside could percolate down and away. Inside this protective shell, he designed his wood stacking with the precision of an engineer. Each cord was stacked on pallets made from scrap lumber, keeping the bottom layer 6 inches off the gravel. The stacks stood in rows with 8-inch gaps between them, creating air channels that ran the full length of the structure. Air entered through the gapped walls near ground level, flowed between the stacks, and exited through vents near the roof peak. It was a convection system powered by temperature differences. Warm air rose and pulled fresh air in from below, creating constant, gentle circulation that carried moisture away while keeping precipitation out. To Thomas, it made perfect sense. To everyone else, it looked like massive overkill. The criticism started the day he finished the roof. Walter Keegan, who'd been logging in the Bitterroot since 1923 and had forgotten more about firewood than most men would ever know, stopped by to see what Thomas was building. He stood in front of the structure for a long time, arms crossed, face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Brennan, I've been cutting and stacking wood for 28 years, never needed more than a good overhang and a tarp." Thomas continued organizing his tools. "I'm not questioning how you do it, Walter. I'm just trying something different." "Different," Keegan snorted. "That's 200 board feet of lumber wrapped around a wood pile. You know what I could build with 200 board feet? A storage shed, a chicken coop, a proper addition to my cabin? Something useful." "This is useful." "It's paranoid is what it is. You're protecting firewood like it's made of gold. It's wood, Thomas. It grows on trees." A few men standing nearby laughed. "And those gaps between the boards? What's that about? If you're going to build walls, build walls. Don't build walls with holes." "The gaps let it breathe," Thomas said. "Keeps air moving without letting weather in." Keegan shook his head slowly, the way a patient man might with a stubborn child. "Air's going to bring moisture. That's what air does when it's cold and wet. You've built yourself a fancy cage that's going to trap humidity around your woodpile all winter." At the mill where Thomas bought his lumber, the owner, a man named Cyrus McCarty who'd seen every kind of frontier construction in 40 years, had his own opinion. "I sold you the lumber, so I can't complain about the business," McCarty said. "But I'll be honest, Thomas. That design doesn't make sense. Wood needs to shed water, sure, but mostly it needs time. You cut it in spring, you split it in summer, you stack it high and let it sit. By November, it's dry enough. Adding walls and a fancy roof, that's not going to make wood drier than time already makes it." "It's not about making it drier," Thomas said. "It's about keeping it dry once it gets there." McCarty wasn't convinced. "You've got 5 cords stacked in that thing now, right? That's maybe $1,800 worth of heating over the winter if you're buying it cut. The structure you built cost you what? $50 in lumber alone, plus your labor. You could have bought an extra cord with that money and just burned through it. Simpler solution." At the general store in Stevensville, the talk was less technical and more blunt. A trapper named Eugene Phelps, who'd wintered in the Bitterroot for 15 years, summed up the community consensus. Brennan built a house for his wood. That's what he did. Gave his firewood better shelter than some families have. Now, I've seen men get peculiar about different things. Seen a fellow build a 6-foot fence around his vegetable garden to keep out deer that weren't even there. Seen another man dig a well in 3 different spots because he didn't trust water that came up too easy. But building a barn for cordwood? That's a new kind of peculiar. The judgment wasn't just about practicality. It was cultural. In the Bitterroot Valley, people prided themselves on doing things the proven way, the way their fathers had done it, the way everyone did it. Tarps and overhangs worked fine. They weren't perfect, but they were good enough. And good enough had kept families warm for generations. Thomas's structure represented something different. It suggested that the old ways weren't good enough, that generations of frontiersmen had been accepting substandard results when better solutions existed. That implication bothered people more than the lumber costs or the odd appearance. Helen Brennan felt the social pressure most directly. At the church social in early October, conversations went quiet when she approached groups of women. Finally, Ida Keegan, Walter's wife, said what others were thinking. "Helen, dear, I know Thomas means well, But people are starting to talk. That structure, it's excessive, isn't it? Walter says it's wasteful. Helen, who'd helped Thomas measure and cut every board, simply smiled. We'll see come February. Winter will tell us what's wasteful and what's wise. But privately, even Helen had doubts. They'd spent $57 on lumber, 3 weeks of Thomas's labor, and built something that dominated their northern property line like a small warehouse. If Thomas was wrong, if the structure didn't actually keep the wood drier than a simple tarp, they'd be financially strained and socially embarrassed. Every time she looked at it, she felt a flutter of uncertainty. Thomas himself seemed unbothered. He spent late September and October cutting, splitting, and stacking. He filled the structure methodically, building his stacks on pallets in neat rows with air gaps between each cord. When neighbors passed and made jokes, "Building a mansion for your maple," or "Next you'll put curtains on your woodpile," he simply nodded and kept working. What his neighbors didn't know was that Thomas had been taking measurements. He had a simple moisture meter, nothing fancy, just a scale and a basics understanding of wood density. Each week he'd pull a test piece from his structure and one from Walter Keegan's tarp-covered pile. He'd weigh them, note the conditions, and track the moisture content. His wood was drying, steadily, measurably drying, even as autumn rains increased. Keegan's wood, protected only by tarps, was holding steady at around 23% moisture. Not terrible, but not optimal. Wood burns best below 15%. By early November, Thomas's test samples were showing 17% moisture. By late November, 15%. The structure was working exactly as designed. But proof wouldn't come from measurements alone. Proof would come when winter arrived with its full brutal force. And winter in the Bitterroot Valley always arrived right on schedule. The first real storm of the 1951-52 winter hit on November 23rd. Not snow, but freezing rain, the worst possible precipitation for firewood storage. It came in waves, coating everything in clear ice. Trees bent under the weight. Power lines snapped. And every woodpile in the valley became a frozen, waterlogged mess. Walter Keegan's carefully tarped stacks took the worst of it. The rain came at an angle, driven by wind, and found its way under the tarps despite the rocks holding them down. By morning, the surface wood was coated in ice. When the temperature dropped and snow piled on top 2 days later, that ice trapped moisture against the wood, creating the perfect conditions for water absorption. Eugene Phelps, the trapper, had his wood stacked under a lean-to attached to his cabin. The roof kept direct precipitation off, but wind-driven freezing rain still reached the back half of his pile. When he pulled logs for his fire that evening, they felt heavy, damp. When he split one open, the interior showed dark streaks where moisture had penetrated the grain. Across the valley, homesteaders checked their wood supplies and saw the same thing: ice, dampness, frozen layers that would need to thaw before the wood could even be split properly. Thomas Brennan walked to his protected structure that same morning. Freezing rain pelted the roof, running off the extended eaves and hitting the ground 3 feet from the walls. Inside, between the gapped boards, he could see his stacked cordwood, dry, untouched by the weather raging outside. The gaps between the boards had worked perfectly. Air moved through, but the battens blocked direct rain. The steep roof shed precipitation before it could pool or penetrate, and the extended eaves created a dead zone where wind lost its force before reaching the walls. He pulled a split log from the top of the nearest stack, light in his hands, dry to the touch. He took it inside, broke off kindling, and lit his fire. It caught immediately, burned hot and clean, and produced almost no smoke. Helen stood watching from the kitchen doorway. "Maybe you weren't so crazy after all," Thomas smiled. "We'll see. Winter's just getting started." The freeze-thaw cycle that followed was brutal. 3 days of freezing rain, then temperatures dropping to 18 below zero. Then a brief warm spell that melted surface ice, followed by another hard freeze. Back and forth, warm and cold, wet and frozen. It was the pattern that destroyed firewood supplies. Each thaw cycle drove moisture deeper into wood that had frozen during the cold. Each freeze expanded that water, splitting fibers and creating channels for even more water to penetrate. By mid-December, wood that had started the season at acceptable moisture levels was approaching 30%. Wet wood doesn't just burn poorly, it actively fights the fire. Every pound of water in a log requires approximately 1,000 BTUs of energy just to evaporate before the wood itself can combust. Families weren't burning wood. They were burning wood to dry wood to burn wood. Walter Keegan, a man who'd never struggled with firewood in his life, found himself feeding his stove every hour instead of every 3 hours. His chimney clogged with creosote every week instead of every month. His cabin temperature hovered around 53 degrees despite constant feeding. Eugene Phelps was burning through a cord every 2 weeks, double his normal rate, and still couldn't get his cabin above 55 degrees. His youngest son had developed a persistent cough that the boy's mother blamed on the smoky fires they were forced to maintain. All over the valley, the same story. Families burning more wood, getting less heat, breathing smoke, and watching their carefully hoarded supplies vanish faster than expected. And then people started noticing the smoke from the Brennan place, or rather, the lack of it. Most cabins in the valley showed thick, constant smoke plumes, the telltale sign of wet wood struggling to burn. The Brennan chimney showed a thin, clean trail, the kind of smoke that comes from dry wood burning efficiently. On December 18th, Cyrus McCarty rode past the Brennan homestead and saw Thomas outside in just a wool shirt, splitting kindling, not frantically burning through his supply, just doing normal daily work, calmly, like it was October instead of the middle of a brutal freeze-thaw cycle. McCarty stopped. "Everything all right, Thomas?" "Fine, Cyrus, just getting ahead on tomorrow's fire." McCarty glanced at the woodpile visible inside the protective structure. "That wood's not frozen?" "Not a bit. Stays dry no matter what the weather does." McCarty rode away troubled. He'd been certain Thomas had wasted money on unnecessary construction. But if that structure was actually keeping wood dry through conditions that were destroying everyone else's supply, then maybe it wasn't waste. Maybe it was the smartest investment anyone in the valley had made. The proof came in January. Measurable, undeniable, impossible to argue proof. By the 3rd week of January, 1952, most homesteaders in the Bitterroot Valley were in crisis mode. They'd burned through 2/3 of their winter wood supply, and based on consumption rates, they weren't going to make it to March without running out. Walter Keegan had started cutting green aspen in desperation. Green wood, wet wood, anything that would burn. His cabin stayed cold, his family stayed miserable, and he'd burned through 4 cords in 2 months, a rate that would require 8 cords to make it through a full winter. Eugene Phelps was rationing. 1 fire in the morning, 1 in the evening. His cabin temperature stayed in the low 40s during the day, mid-30s at night. His children slept in coats under piles of blankets. And then Cyrus McCarty, unable to help himself, stopped by the Brennan place to ask a direct question. "Thomas, how much wood have you burned since November?" Thomas thought about it. "About 1 cord and 1/4, maybe 1/3. McCarty stood silent, doing the math. "I'm burning half a cord every 10 days. That's 3 times what you're using." "More than 3 times. Dry wood burns hot," Thomas said simply. "Hot fire needs less fuel, and it burns clean, so no creosote, no smoke, just heat." McCarty looked at the protective structure, its walls keeping weather away from neatly stacked rows of cordwood. "What's the moisture content in there?" "Last I checked, 12 to 14%. About as dry as wood gets without a kiln." "And mine's at, what would you guess?" "If you've been through these freeze-thaw cycles, probably 25 to 30%. McCarty nodded slowly. The numbers were brutal. Wet wood at 30% moisture produced roughly half the heat of dry wood at 15%, which meant you needed to burn twice as much to get the same warmth. The math was simple and devastating. Word spread fast. By the end of January, men were stopping by the Brennan place to see the structure for themselves. Thomas didn't advertise or charge for tours, but he never turned anyone away. He'd walk them through the Design, explaining the ventilation principle, the importance of the gravel floor for drainage, the way the gapped walls allowed air circulation without admitting precipitation. Walter Keegan came on February 3rd. He stood in front of the structure for a long time, then stepped inside and looked at the stacked cords, bone dry, split and ready. "I was wrong," he said finally. "This isn't paranoid. This is practical." Thomas offered no judgment. "You've kept your family warm for 28 years, Walter. That's what matters. But I could have kept them warmer, could have burned half the wood and had twice the heat. You proved that." The admission cost Walter something. Pride, maybe, or the certainty that comes from doing things the same way your whole life. But he said it anyway, and Thomas respected him for it. By spring of 1952, something had shifted in the Bitterroot Valley. The structure that had been mocked was now being measured, photographed, and discussed at every gathering. Men brought notebooks, asked about board spacing, wanted to know the exact dimensions of the gravel foundation. Eugene Phelps built the first replication in April, a smaller version that held 3 cords instead of 6. By May, Walter Keegan was constructing his own, using the same gapped wall principle but adding his own modifications based on 30 years of logging experience. By the time autumn rolled around again, 12 homesteads within 20 miles of Stevensville had built protected wood storage structures. They weren't all identical. Some used different roof pitches. Some added side doors. A few creative builders even incorporated the design into existing sheds, just adding the ventilation gaps and drainage floors. But they all shared the same core insight: keep precipitation away from the wood while allowing air to circulate. Let physics do the work. The results were consistent. Wood stored in protected structures maintained moisture content between 12 and 18%, regardless of weather conditions. Wood stored under tarps or lean-tos fluctuated between 20 and 35% depending on freeze-thaw cycles. That difference translated directly into fuel consumption. Protected storage users burned roughly 50 to 60% less wood for comparable heat. They spent less time splitting, less time feeding fires, and less time dealing with creosote buildup and chimney problems. But more than efficiency, they gained comfort. Families who'd spent previous winters huddled near struggling fires, watching children shiver, breathing smoke from wet wood, those families now lived in actual warmth. They ate meals without coats. They slept without piling on every blanket they owned. They woke to coals that were still hot enough to restart without kindling. Winter stopped being something to endure and became just weather. The Brennan structure itself stood for another 42 years. Thomas maintained it carefully, replacing worn boards, re-shimming posts that settled. His children inherited the property in the 1970s, and they kept the design, understanding that their father hadn't just built a woodshed. He'd built a solution to a problem that most people didn't even realize could be solved. In the early 1990s, a forestry student from the University of Montana studied fuel consumption patterns in rural Montana. His thesis included measurements from 18 households, 9 using protected storage and 9 using traditional methods. The data was clear. Protected storage reduced winter fuel consumption by an average of 53%, while improving combustion efficiency and reducing creosote-related chimney problems by 74%. The conclusion noted something Thomas had understood 40 years earlier. The problem wasn't the wood, it was the storage. Solve storage, and everything else falls into place. Thomas Brennan never sought recognition for his design. He didn't patent it or publish plans or travel to demonstrate the concept. He just continued living on his property, cutting timber, raising his family, and staying warm through Montana winters using a fraction of the wood his neighbors required. But his name became attached to the concept anyway. In builder conversations across western Montana, people would reference the Brennan Shelter or that ventilated storage design from Stevensville. Not because Thomas promoted it, but because results speak louder than marketing ever could. The winter of 1951 to 52 had tested his theory under conditions that strained conventional methods. His structure had kept wood dry while neighbors' supplies turned to ice-logged, smoke-producing fuel. The mockery had lasted 3 months. The validation would last decades because Thomas Brennan understood something that most builders had overlooked in their acceptance of traditional methods. Keeping firewood dry wasn't about stronger tarps or better overhangs. It was about creating an environment where moisture never reached the wood in the first place. Complete weather protection with continuous air circulation. It wasn't paranoid. It wasn't excessive. It was exactly what survival required when you understood that winter's real enemy wasn't cold. It was moisture that stole your fuel's efficiency and turned every fire into a battle instead of a solution. The old-timers who'd laughed at the barn built around a woodpile lived long enough to see their grandchildren construct similar designs. Some admitted they'd been wrong. Most just quietly adopted the improvements and moved on. That's how real wisdom spreads. Not through apologies or dramatic conversions, but through the silent recognition that better methods deserve to replace worse ones, regardless of how long the worse ones have been used. Thomas's structure still stands today, maintained by his grandson on the original property. The walls are weathered, the roof has been reshingled twice, but the design remains unchanged. And on January nights when wind screams down from the Bitterroot peaks and temperatures drop below zero, that structure still keeps firewood dry, still allows air circulation, still proves that the solution everyone called crazy was actually the only design that understood the problem correctly. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever tried to survive? Hit that subscribe button for one proven frontier technique every week, and hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the simple problems everyone accepts when they could be solving them instead. Because sometimes the wisdom isn't in doing things the way they've always been done. Sometimes it's in asking whether the way they've always been done actually works as well as it could. And sometimes building a shed around your firewood isn't excessive. It's exactly what winter demands when you stop accepting wet wood as inevitable and start treating dry storage as the engineering problem it actually is.